Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Tamara Leitner, who is inside the H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum.
We're here in Miami, where people are already feeling the effects of the government shutdown. Only a foot or two away.
I've covered thousands of stories in my career, but this one, it held on to me. I could never let it go.
As an investigative reporter, Tammy Leitner's work has garnered her a dozen Emmys, a Peabody Award, and even an Edward R. Murrow Award for her international investigation into a U.S. government cover-up. But Leitner's book, Don't Say a Thing, A Predator, A Pursuit, and the Women Who Persevered, recounts the story that was written over decades. While interviewing survivors of serial rapist Claude Dean Hull's assaults and rapes, Leitner was able to come to terms with her own trauma. The discussion of sexual assault survival is an important issue for our moderator, Mandi Price. Price herself is a survivor, owning her power in bold, right alongside her producing credits on Instagram. Please welcome them both to the Northwest Passages stage.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Northwest Passages. You guys have made this week exceptional. Thank you. We're going to start off just a little bit of for those who have read the book or have started reading the book, it's a bit heavy. And I want to respect, as a survivor, emotion. And it's okay. We may bring up some topics that are triggering, and it's okay if you feel the need to stand up, exit, come back. It won't bother us. It won't bother the room. This is a safe space. It's important that we keep safe spaces. And as Tammy is one of my safe people, and I'm sharing her with all of you, and she's quite exceptional. And if you feel the need to depart, it's okay. Like, own it. We're good.
Yeah, one thing that is very important for both of us tonight, since Mandi and I have both been through trauma, it's something that we both share. We really want tonight to be about empowerment. And a big part of empowerment is owning your truth. And that means owning your feelings also. So own whatever you are feeling tonight and be okay with it.
There we go. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. So I read Tammy's book when it came, before it was released, and I pretty much immediately called Rob and was like, we got to bring her down here. We got to bring her. Oh, well, there we go. We got to bring her to Spokane. I was like, I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of things, and I want to bring, it's okay. I want to bring her here because I want to talk about it. And I want to talk about it with my community. 20 years ago, you started this book, Tammy, and then you stopped. Why'd you come back?
Let me start by taking you through how this kind of started for me. So I was living in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was April 1999, and I got up early one morning, 5 a.m. or so, to take my dog for a walk. Opened the front door of my apartment, and I couldn't leave. I was blocked in by crime scene tape, and it stretched from my apartment to my next-door neighbor's apartment. And I poked my head underneath, and I peered into her apartment, and I could see it was disheveled. There was something amiss. She wasn't there, and there was officers down the hall talking, and so I poked my head back, and I waited. And they came down the hallway, and they told me that my neighbor had been assaulted. Asked me if I'd heard anything, asked me a few questions, interviewed my boyfriend and myself who had been home that night. And then I had to go to work that day. I was a crime reporter at a local newspaper in town, and I had to write about the assault. That was my job. I went to work, I wrote 8 inches about the story, And I came home that night at 6 o'clock at night, and detectives were still there. Scottsdale, Arizona is a very affluent community, upscale, and it was very uncommon, still is to an extent, to have a sexual assault, especially by somebody that was unknown, a stranger rape. And so I got home at 6 o'clock. I was kind of surprised to see detectives still out there. And I walked past them and I overheard them talking, and they said to each other, she didn't see his face, the assailant who broke into her apartment. All she saw was that he had a green mask over his face, a tattoo on one arm, and a black Velcro watch on the other wrist. I walked past them, walked into my apartment, and there in the middle of my apartment was a black Velcro watch. And that was how I got involved in this case. And that was what began my 20-year journey.
What was going through your head in that moment? Of like, was it shock? Was it?
Oh shit. No, seriously. Oh shit.
Yeah.
He's been in my apartment. There was not a doubt in my mind. I mean, imagine as a woman walking into your apartment, your next door neighbor has just been brutally sexually assaulted, and I assumed he's been in my apartment.
At that moment, you went from journalist, storyteller, to potential. You became part of the story you were trying to tell. Like, what happened? Like, what? Continue on.
Well, as every journalist, the first rule of thumb is don't become part of the story.
Yes.
That's the first thing they teach you in J school. You know, this is something you don't want to have happen, but it's something that obviously I didn't choose to have happen. And so the first thing that, you know, started going through my mind was, okay, how did this happen? Did he get in here when I was asleep? And if so, how did he get in? My boyfriend was here. My 130-pound Newfoundland was in bed with us. My mind is just ticking through these things. How could this have happened? Did he come in? Did he leave? And so I went through a lot of the same feelings that I'm sure crime victims go through. That feeling of insecurity, that feeling of being invaded. And I felt like I was on the other side for a moment. And for a moment, I understood what all of the people that I interview as a crime reporter feel like to be on that side. And it's an awful, sinking, terrible feeling. And as the moments ticked by, as the hours ticked by, and the detectives began questioning me, began questioning my boyfriend. Could he have done this? Is he the rapist? Where was he last night? They swabbed him for DNA. Did he have anything to do with this? You can see how this plays out slowly. It's a sinking feeling.
So Tammy and I, full disclosure, is, again, she's like one of my besties. So in its original conception, this book was a true crime book. And then there was a moment when you went back to it after you had stopped that it became a memoir, a true crime memoir. What was that process like? And how was that difficult? Was it a difficult decision to, again, kind of insert yourself into a story? And as a journalist, the rule of thumb is to not insert yourself into a story.
Yeah, I never intended for this to be part memoir. I never intended to tell my own story. So I started writing this book 20 years ago. And it was, as Mandi said, a true crime book then. I started writing it after they captured this man, this predator. And I wrote about 130 pages. I couldn't finish the book. There was something keeping me from finishing it. So I put all the crime scene photos, all the boxes and boxes of evidence that I had, of interview tapes, everything away. And I packed it up. And every time I moved, I took the boxes with me. I took everything with me. And as she said, it took me about 20 years to dig it out and start writing it again. And when I started writing it again, it became a very different book. It wasn't as much a true crime book as it was my part of the journey along with those crimes.
It's you have a superpower, and I am a firm believer that we have superpowers. Your superpower, Tammy Leitner, is that you can get anyone to talk about anything, even if they don't want to. I have often been in your tangle of webs because you're so good at it that all of a sudden I find myself just spewing all the secrets. And you do it in the quick, like you're so good at it. What your book, you speak to so many survivors and warriors, and what was your approach like in, it's a difficult thing to talk to a survivor. We're real good at like not disclosing anything, saying just enough and also nothing at all. How as a journalist and how as an empath, really, did you break that barrier with these women over the course of your decades-long journey of this story?
You know, the first thing that I realized when I started writing this book again was that I really needed to talk to the women who were impacted by this predator. And I also needed to find the women who that we didn't know were assaulted. So I felt like I really had a journey to go on, talking to all of these women. And when I approached them, I was very, very forthcoming about my personal connection to this. And part of that was that I was traumatized by what he had done. I'd carried this with me for 20 years. When he assaulted my neighbor, it happened just on the other side of the wall. And I don't think for a very long time I knew how greatly it affected me and how I carried that so close to my heart. As a journalist, we put up walls, and we have to. That's how we are able to do our job. But this story hit really, really close to home. And so when I started talking to these women, I found myself sharing a bit of myself with them. And it was very cathartic for me to talk to them. And it was a bit of a give and take. And we developed relationships, these women and I. And many of them were still friends today. But I think that was how some of them decided to open up to me through that relationship that we developed.
Yeah, I would agree. The story of Survivor is so important in this book, and you provide so much space and energy to tell that story. What is it like, or how could you describe, like, how do you separate the two, being so fully invested in the story as a journalist, but also being so connected to it? I mean, you describe in your book that you're obsessed with the story. So how do you separate the two? Can you separate the two? Does it just become part of you?
There was no separating back then. I'm curious, how many of you have read the book? Okay, so just a handful. So I don't want to give away too much. But at the time, I was living this story. So imagine my neighbor had been assaulted, and they were looking for this predator who turns out to be a serial rapist. Detectives discovered that he had been doing this for 2 decades. And so my neighbor moves out, so her apartment is empty. I'm still living there. He's on the loose. I'm covering this story after story. Detectives are finding out details. I'm finding out little details. And this is all in real time. And I remember every night I would go, and my sidebar, my live-in boyfriend had to move out during that time. And so I was home alone. And so every night I remember I would barricade myself into my apartment. I would stack up furniture in front of my front door, chairs and tables. And this was my home security system to protect myself in case he came back. I mean, he had already been there once. He had told the woman, my neighbor, that he was going to come back. So why wouldn't he? And so there was no separation between home and the assault and what was going to happen next. For me, it was a 24-hour thing that I was constantly living in my mind and at work and every single day after day after day. And so that was probably why I had some PTSD going through it for a while.
For the course of the decades in which this man roamed freely, he was caught, he was released, he was caught again, then released. He did this under fake names, pseudonyms. Why do you think that would happen today? Is our technology better? Or do you think that, I think this is still happening, but do you think it was the time period in which he was doing these assaults that provided just the complete, he was able to cross state lines and no one could catch him?
So this happened during the 1970s and the 1980s. This was the perfect time, the perfect storm, because police agencies were not talking to each other. That's the first thing. The second thing is he was a master manipulator at the system. He had learned all the tricks. And he was also a master at transforming his identity. Once police caught on to him, he would change states, change names, change identities. He left behind wives, children, jobs. Do I think this could happen now? Yes. Do I think it could happen as easily? No.
That makes sense. When you came back to the book after having time away, a brief hiatus of a long journey, one of the decisions that you had made was to visit many, many crime scenes. And you walk us through in your book your journey through those crime scenes in a very, I would say, detailed but respectful way. Why?
For me, it's always been important, not only to understand what the predator was thinking, but I also wanted to understand what the survivors were experiencing, what they were going through. And so that's why I go back to each and every one of the crime scenes, because I want to see it from his perspective and I want to see it from their perspective. I want to see how they lived, what they might have been thinking, what they might have been seeing at the time. And so that's why I went back to each and every one.
Was there ever a time when you were scared of going to one of these?
I know where you're going with this.
The buddy story might be one, perhaps.
So my friends and family are not happy with me for this one. So I took a trip up north to visit a couple of the crime scenes. And while I was there, I went to where the predator's brother had lived. And the predator. And I'm referring to him as the predator because, I mean, why use his name? Why give him any publicity? But so I went to where he had lived with his brother, and I figured, I want to go see the house. I want to see where he stayed for months and months. And so I was sitting across the street, and I was just kind of taking it in. I was taking some pictures, and the front door slams open, and some guy comes out on the porch. "What are you doing? What are you doing photographing my house?" And I said, "Hi, I'm a journalist. I'm Tammy. Could I come over and talk to you? I'm just taking some pictures of your house. Somebody used to live here. His name's Danny Hall, and he was the brother of a guy that I'm trying to, write a story on." "Oh, I know that guy." I'm like, "You know him?" And he's like, "Yeah, he lived here right before me. Come on over here and talk to me." So it turns out the person who's living in the house now knew the brother of the predator. I go over there. He had security cameras. That's why he saw me sitting across the street. To make a long story short, he asked me to drive around to the back of his property, and he was going to introduce me to somebody who knew the family. I did that. It probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. It was a very secluded bit of farmland. Nobody knew where I was. I hadn't left addresses with anybody. It had been a while since I had been out in the field telling anybody, reporting to anybody where I was, and I didn't really expect to run into anybody that knew the family. So it turned out to be okay, but in the long run, I actually ended up on the phone with the brother of the predator. And so it all worked out okay. I got an interview, and he talked to me, and he told me some stories about his brother, and he told me some things that I didn't know that were very enlightening. But there was a moment when I thought to myself, what the hell are you doing, Tammy? This was not smart. I think that's what you were referring to.
That's exactly what I was referring to. Thank you. Thank you for that. Oftentimes in this book, you're extremely vulnerable in this book. You really open up not only your personal journey of the decades following, but your trauma, and you express it in a way that is unfiltered. Why did you decide to be so candid in your memoir when you really didn't have to be?
So I went through a very traumatic relationship where I suffered a lot of emotional abuse. And for 20 years, I was drowning in shame. I did not tell anybody what I went through. And so when I started talking to these survivors, I suddenly started telling them my story. As they were telling me their story, I opened up to them, and it was a bond that we started sharing. And there was a few women that told me they felt, one in particular, that the assault was her fault. And I just looked at her and I said, this assault absolutely was not your fault. There was another woman that said she still felt shame about it. And the more I talked to these women, the more I realized that I wanted to share my shame and my trauma and what I had been through in order to possibly help others move through their trauma and their shame. I thought if my story and my speaking out can help just a little bit and help people learn to speak out and move forward through theirs, then there's a reason that I went through it. And so I guess they helped me, in a way, overcome my trauma. And that's probably the reason I decided to talk about it, because they were so helpful in my journey that I wanted to give back.
I love that. I love that. I think it's an essential part of your book, and I think it's a storytelling mechanism that I've not seen or read in a very long time. Critics of your book say that probably shouldn't have done it. Probably should have just kept it to a true crime, kind of memoir, like just a true crime book. I personally feel that it's essential because it's one more voice to the voiceless who are often, shame is shame. Vulnerability is vulnerability. Often in your book, I would find myself reflecting back on my own trauma in a way that is an experience that I've not felt. And I read a quote once about healing the healer. As a journalist, we are often confronted with crime in a way that we have to detach. How did you manage to do that at a young age as a new reporter entering this world, but also going back and researching and diving back into this world? How did you do that in a way where you felt protected and also able to tell the story?
I don't think as a young journalist, I really knew how to appropriately interview a woman who had been sexually assaulted. This isn't really something they teach you in J school. And so
Nope.
I just did what I thought was appropriate, and that's sit there and listen, be empathetic. I remember with one of the women, I reached over and I hugged her, and I'm pretty sure that's not what we're supposed to do. But you know what? To me, it felt right. And to this day, I can't tell you how many women I've hugged that were survivors of sexual assault, because it's just what I feel. And so that's the one thing that I've learned. For me, what's right is to do what I feel when I'm interviewing somebody, or when I'm sitting across and they're pouring out their heart and their soul, because reliving the worst moment of your life and choosing to share your story with me is a pretty damn big deal. And I don't take that lightly. So if I feel like I want to hug you, I'm going to hug you. And so I just kind of found my own way. And that worked for me.
She will hug you. She's a great hugger. I love this book for many reasons, but you dedicate this book for the survivors. And that's such a bold statement to say. You reference in court the victim statements, the power of a victim statement, and how most victims don't get their day in court. I know I never did. And we don't get to express our thoughts. You provide in this book many opportunities, candidly, with these women. What I found empowering is that I don't think I've ever read a book where I've felt so seen and heard. And I can't truly thank you enough for providing that space in that moment. And then kind of in the end, you kind of give this follow-up of where everyone's at in this journey and how there's no wrong way to be a survivor of such a traumatic thing, and how each person handled, you know, their lives were changed. Your life is changed. There's always a before, there's always an after. And you provide that space so delicately and eloquently. How do we continue to do that in spaces that are, people don't want to talk about this. It's hard. But how do we provide as a community, as a family, spaces where men, women, children can speak up and feel safe and empowered, and what can we do?
By doing exactly what we're doing here tonight. Can we just take a minute and give everybody that showed up here tonight a hand, please? This is exactly what we need to do. We need to have a dialogue. And it's hard sometimes. I mean, you hear about murder. You hear about war. You hear about robbery. You hear about all this stuff, but you don't hear about sexual assault that often. People don't talk about it. Or if they do, did you hear she was sexually assaulted? That's what they do. We still do that. It's hard to talk about. And so if we continue the dialogue, we make it easier to talk about, the stigma will go away. The woman who I interviewed, who still feels shame today, won't feel that shame. The woman who I interviewed, who still feels like it's her fault, won't feel like it's her fault if we continue to talk about it. We will realize it is always the predator's fault. It's never the woman's fault or the man's fault. It's always the predator's fault.
I love you. Open it up for questions. Thank you for that. Questions?
Questions from the audience?
From the audience.
Play Stump the Author. I'll be right over with the microphone. Start right back here.
You said that you approached this from getting yourself into the head of the victim and that of the perpetrator. Isn't that a little bit like method acting? I mean, how did you not freak yourself out, scare the crap out of yourself, you know, have to snap away from that?
I didn't know that I was going to be able to talk to him. I had read every single police report, and so I only knew what he was thinking through the police reports and through what he had told or said to the women, what they had repeated to the detectives. I had written him letters over the years, 20 years. I had written him letters in prison because I did want to understand why he did these things. But more importantly, I knew that there were women out there whose cases had never been connected to him. Detectives believed that he had assaulted as many as 100 women, but he had only admitted to 18. And so when I started writing this book, my hope was to find some of those women. I only found one. So I feel like my job isn't done yet, but that was why I initially set out to talk to him. And so over the course of about a year and a half, I corresponded with him in prison. He finally did agree to talk to me. But that was the initial reason that I wanted to get into his head, was to understand and try and find those women. And can you imagine being assaulted by somebody and not knowing that he's in prison and behind bars? Wouldn't you sleep better knowing that? But did it freak me out? I don't know. I think living with this for 20 years probably freaked me out a bit more. I mean, the thought, honestly, of these women not getting their day in court freaked me out even more. I mean, that just sucks. Honestly. I mean, not being able to confront this person, if you want to confront him after he takes away the most important thing and changes your life completely, it just felt like I needed to fight for them and to be able to give them that little piece of something back. It felt like it was worth it.
Hi, ladies.
Hi.
So there's so many questions around true crime reporting and the ethics of it. You know, we've become this society that gets entertainment from these grotesque things. And I think your style of writing in a memoir somewhat, you know, kind of peripherally addresses that a bit. But my question is more about our responsibility. When I think about the row of 18-year-old Gonzaga students sitting behind me, what if they go take one of these classes you're talking about where they say, as a journalist, you're not supposed to be a part of the story, and then they end up, I was hearing a fellow talk about his crime writing. He plowed through several marriages and drugs and alcohol, and Patton Oswalt's wife, McNamara, I can't remember her first, Michelle McNamara, who, got so caught up in true crime reporting and died due to accidental substance overdose. Whereas you were, is it, to say my question, is it disingenuous or naive to tell journalists you're not supposed to be a part of the story? These people were clearly a part of the story. How can we continue to pretend you can write about this stuff without being involved in this stuff? How do we protect our future journalists back there by not perpetuating that message?
I do not advocate first-person journalism.
Agreed.
At all. Me writing this book as a memoir, it's a memoir and a true crime book. But I don't advocate first-person journalism. There is a time and a place, and it's a rarity. But the reporting that we do as journalists, guys, the reporting that we do as journalists, traditional journalists, we don't put ourselves in the story. We go out and we report the facts. So there are very few instances when you may report it through your eyes as part of the story. This is a special situation. And I would hope that our young journalists that we're turning out understand that this is not the norm.
Do you miss being out chasing stories? Now I understand you're a professor and a media consultant.
Yeah. I am, yeah. I mean, I was just out there a couple years ago when I was researching this, and I'm looking for my next project.
Excellent.
So I'm still a journalist. Yes, I'm a professor and I'm a consultant, but I'm still an investigative journalist. And as soon as I find my next project, I'll be back out there in the field.
Right here.
Hi, this is going back to the very beginning of what you said, is then when you walked back into your space, you saw that watch. When do you feel that that predator went into your space?
Do you want me to tell you, for those of you that haven't read the book?
No.
Buy your book, so if it's better to wait. That was the part that absolutely freaked me out, and I
don't mind telling you guys, but some of you don't want to know. So
We'll sidebar.
let me see a show of hands. That how many want me to tell you? Okay, so the rest of you, I guess, should plug your ears. I mean, do you guys? Okay, all right. So I guess I'll tell you guys, and the rest.
It's in like the 5th page. It's very early on.
So they ended up swabbing my boyfriend for DNA because they did think for a bit it could have been him. And I mean, we spent the day searching to see how this person could have gotten into my apartment. And what we ended up figuring out was after the detectives had interviewed my boyfriend and I, we had taken my dog out for a walk. And remember, she's a 130-pound Newfoundland, and she has a tendency to pick things up in her mouth. And so they believe that when he left the apartment, he had gone out on the greenbelt and ran, and that's where we had walked the dog, and they think she had picked up his watch in her mouth.
Am I good? Okay. So this question is actually just for me because just like as a journalist, I want to know. I've done a lot of crime reporting in Idaho, and I struggle to deal with the stuff that comes along with that, and I'm wondering how you personally were able to like. I mean, it's not like I don't know how to describe it, sorry. Not like deal with it, but, kind of address it and then, put it away in a safe spot or kind of like work through it. I don't know what your best advice would be for someone like me or someone like the rest of my coworkers who actually try to, report the facts, but also see horrible, horrible things. So I don't know like what your best take on that would be, but that's why I'm asking.
I was just asked that question earlier today in one of the journalism classes. I think it's hard, and I've seen a lot of really, really good journalists burn out over the years because they don't address that very well. Or they're not able to put up a wall. Some people, I think, have a better coping mechanism than other people. I happen to have a very good ability to kind of divide my emotions, and I was able to, for 25 years, put up a wall, and it didn't catch up with me until I left the network about 4 years ago, and then kind of everything came crashing down, and I went into very intensive therapy, which I write about in my book, and I had to deal with a lot of trauma. And part of that was a lot of things that I had seen on the job. My best advice to you would be know what your limits are and know how to process and talk about it. For me, I didn't talk about anything for decades. And quite honestly, I knew that certain members of my family didn't want to hear about it. It was tough for them, So you need to find a safe place, somebody that you can talk to about these things. And now newsrooms more and more are offering, after we cover school shootings, they're offering counseling and therapy. Take them up on it. And if they're not offering it, go to HR and insist on it. I'm not joking.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many school shootings I've covered in my career. I mean, dozens. And they've offered therapy for one of them, I think. So you need to also become an advocate for your own mental health as a journalist. And I think this generation of younger journalists, they are very good about advocating for their mental health. And so you are your best advocate. That's my best advice for you.
Thank you.
And 2 last questions here.
I was just curious. I'd imagine with true crime reporting, and maybe this story, maybe others, that the instances you're getting to talk to the predator or the criminal, you're often walking into a very manipulative person who might have their own agenda and idea of how they're going to control you, control the story, control the situation. How do you armor up to spot that and not have that impact your reporting?
Well, with this predator, I spent a year and a half corresponding with him, and I knew that most of the things coming out of his mouth were manipulative. Everything that he wrote was, what can I get out of it? What can I get out of you? But as far as short-term reporting that a younger reporter might be going through, or a day of reporter, or even a long format reporter, you have to know going in, if you're questioning somebody, if you're doing a hard interview, the person is not going to just turn around and be like, you got me. I stole millions. Or, yeah, I did this to this person. They're always going to have a defense. And so my best advice to you is listen to what they're saying. Really listen. So many young reporters don't listen to what the person is saying. Listen to what they say and be thoughtful in your response. Listen to what they say and respond with another question. I mean, I always go in with a list of questions, but half the time I don't use them because I want to listen to what they're saying and ask another question based on what they say to me. Does that make sense?
Okay, last question.
Well, this is interesting because in the 1960s, this happened to my best friend and I lived next door to her. I had my boyfriend with me. She was single at the time. We had identical apartments, one wall apart. The rapist came in through her kitchen window, which she hadn't securely locked. And so she came over to me, middle of the night, and we called the police from there. She didn't want to call the police because back in the 60s, things were different then, and the cops always, and in the trial, she did get her day in court, they always want to convict the victim. How sexually active were you, and all kinds of things like that. Luckily, we did get a police person who was pretty good at the way he handled it all. But this is bringing it all up, and I'm thinking back now over our long, long friendship, all the strange behavior she's had over the years, and the way she reacts to things. I think it's all because she left that unaddressed.
Trauma manifests itself in different ways for everybody. And whether she dealt with it or didn't deal with it, it may come up in the years. It's just sexual assault can affect everybody differently, and it unfortunately changes the course of a lot of people's lives. I would hope that your friend got some help, but back in the 60s, that's a tough time, or 70s, that's a time when not a lot of people talked about it. So I'm sorry for your friend, what happened to her. Did you want to add anything, Mandi?
I mean, just the contribution of that, again, kind of speaking to the before and the after. I personally, you will never see me with my back to a door. You will never, I sit at the table on the left side always. There is never a moment when my front door and back door and every door in my house is locked, is locked. I do things unconsciously. It doesn't faze me. It's just the patterns of behavior in which I have. I think that is, I've done lots of therapy, and that's a trauma response, and a self-preservation response. But also, for me, it's, in times of stress, I still get panic attacks. It's fight or flight. And I think having been through years and years and years of therapy, I was saved by it. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been in years and years and years of therapy. That's always my first thing, is go see a therapist and find, audition them and find one that will save you, because there is one. And when you talk about it, it's kind of back to Tammy's book of empowerment. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about it, but talking about it's hard. And being honest about it is also hard. But a therapist arms you with the tools to do it in a way where you're protecting not only your heart, but your mind, and that you're creating a safe space so that you can deal with the reactions after telling your story. I will say for me, my story is very formulaic. I say the same thing If someone were to ask me like what it is, like it's very formulaic. There's no emotion tied to it whatsoever. Healthy or not, I don't know. But I think there's no wrong way to be a survivor. And I think every way you deal with it is 100% acceptable. And that idea of being a survivor is what empowers you to keep going. And when you go from being a victim to a survivor, it changes everything. That moment, I remember that moment so clearly. When I walked into a police station and told my story, that was the day I became a survivor 20 years later. And that's as I told my story.
Let's thank them both. That was an incredible discussion. So Tamara's book is available out in the lobby.